exclusive. Bye. Next to each other. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, I did a project with Bob on analyzing the Holocaust from an evolutionary perspective. I wanted to test the question about whether, at the time it was commonplace for people to say that Hitler was crazy, and there was something that bothered me about that. I think there's something actually dangerous that we dismiss somebody like Hitler as crazy before we understand actually what they're up to. So when I saw your video clip,
turn right, then turn left.
I thought it would be worth having a discussion so that we could figure.
Turn right. In 700 feet, turn right on Enterprise Road.
What perspective makes sense?
That sounds like an awesome topic, but before we get to that, I would really like to know what's going on with you, because you're at the center of this crazy controversy of Evergreen State College. You essentially left the area. You're suing the college now. So where do you stand now?
We have not yet filed suit, and in fact, I can't talk
Turn right on Enterprise Road.
about what took place inside the negotiation, but we had our first sit-down with the college yesterday, and this was an attempt.
In 300 feet, use the right lane to turn right on State Route 132. Turn right on State Route 132.
To avert a suit. But I will say, from where I sit, as hard as this is to believe, it appears that the college has learned nothing from this episode, and that it is doubling down on the same foolish sets of beliefs and assumptions that got it into trouble in the first place. So that is not a hopeful situation.
In half a mile, at the roundabout, take the third exit on State Route 28.
No, and for anybody that's not aware of what this whole story is about, you would either have to go back to Brett's podcast that we did a few months back, or please just Google Evergreen State University and Google Brett, and you will be blown away by the insanity. It's social justice warrior gone amok. The whole campus, kids patrolling the campus with baseball bats. I mean, the whole thing is just...
In 1,000 feet, at the roundabout, take the third exit.
Completely bananas. The president of the university being told by the children not to use his hands when he's speaking because it's a microaggression. So he puts his hands down, the children start cheering and laughing. They don't realize...
At the roundabout, take the third exit on State Route 28.
Being played. The whole thing is just some crazy grand game by the children, and I'm calling them children, I don't give a fuck how old they are, to have power over people. I mean, it's essentially what this is all boiling down to. And you really see it in that moment where they tell him to put his hands down, and he does, and they laugh and cheer and think it's amazing.
Well, they're educated to do that to some degree, because one of the tenets of the postmodernism that they're being spoon-fed is that there's nothing but power. That's the only thing that mediates relationships between people, because there's no real world.
In half a mile, turn left on Yarmouth Road. Approaching a railroad crossing.
Everything's a social construct, and it's a landscape of conflict between groups. That's the postmodern world, and the only actual means of expression is power. That's why the postmodernists make the claim constantly that the patriarchy is a corrupt institution, because they look at hierarchical organizations, and they're stratified. Obviously, there's people at the top and people at the bottom. The only reason that there are people at the top is because they dominate by power. There's no philosophy of authority.
In 1,000 feet, turn left.
But that's all gone. And so, and if you're cynical about that sort of thing, and you should be, you might say that part of the reason that the only thing that...
Turn left on Yarmouth Road.
The postmodernists believe in is power is because that helps them justify their arbitrary use of it under any circumstances whatsoever. And I think that's right. I think that's exactly what happens. So it's not surprising that you see this manifested in the mob-like behavior of the students. It's right in accordance with everything they're being taught. So,
well, they're also being taught in this sort of any means necessary to get over the establishment. Like, the establishment is this horrible institution, and they can justify pretty much anything.
Yes.
This is what, like, punch a Nazi. Who's a Nazi? Everybody that doesn't agree.
In 1.9 miles, exit to US 6 East, Orleans, Provincetown.
I mean, it's essentially what's being said ad nauseum in social justice warrior circles online, and you see, I've seen punch a Nazi so many times. I mean, but when it came down to Charlottesville, there was very little punching of Nazis. You know, the whole thing was like it's all very insane. When you see real Nazis, like those are real Nazis. You know, like go fucking punch them, please. You know,
well, we've also, I think,
and don't even do that, by the way.
Right. Well, and
Yeah.
I think we've already figured out, everyone, right from the right to the left, everyone's figured out that wherever the Nazis went, that was wrong. We've all
Yes.
agreed on that. We're not going there anymore. And so when someone pops up and says, well, we should go there, it's like they're immediately identifiable. You can box them in, and if you have any sense, like like many conservatives did in the aftermath of Charlottesville, they come out and say, well, in case it needs to be said again, we're actually not allied with those people.
Yeah, well, that was the most disturbing thing for many people about Donald Trump's reaction to it, that he didn't take a hard stance against these white supremacists showing up with tiki torches, walking through the street, yelling anti-Semitic phrases or whatever. I don't know exactly what they're yelling. I've read a bunch of different things, but the whole thing was an abomination. I mean, it was a horrific thing to watch. And Donald Trump comes out and says there was horrible behavior on all sides.
Yeah, well, I thought about that for a lot, because I got tangled up with that in a strange way in Canada. I was supposed to appear on a panel, discussing the suppression of free speech on university campuses, which was then promptly canceled by the university that was going to host it in the aftermath of Charlottesville, partly because one of the panelists was going to be Faith Goldie, who was the journalist that was covering Charlottesville and got the footage of the car and the damage.
Wow.
But we were targeted immediately afterward with the Nazi epithet, and Ryerson shut down the free speech panel. So it's coming up again in November.
How were you
11th.
targeted you were targeted as Nazis?
Yeah. What happened was this person put up a Facebook page and used a swastika with a no, like a circle with a line through it, and said no fascists at Ryerson, essentially. But she used the swastika, and she got a bunch of people rallied together to pressure the university administration into canceling the event, which they promptly did. And then they had a celebration party the night of the event. And here's something that was really interesting. So they got a couple of hundred people out to the celebration at Ryerson, and they were united under the banner.
In 1,000 feet, exit right.
Of the hammer and sickle, and were calling for revolution. And what was so interesting about that, and I really mean technically that it was interesting, was that the mainstream media said virtually nothing.
Exit right to US 6 East, Orleans, Provincetown.
The fact that these, let's call them counter-protesters, I don't know exactly how you term them, had come out under this murderous symbol. And that's made me think, like, I can't figure out why the swastika is an immediate identifier of a pathological personality, and the hammer and sickle isn't. There's actually a reason. It isn't just arbitrary. And I think maybe it's something like the Nazi is the guy who knifes you in the alley and steals your wallet, and the communist is the white-collar criminal who takes your pension. And you're actually more afraid of the first person than the second person, because the damage they do is more proximal and emotionally recognizable. But the second guy who takes your pension, for example, he's perhaps even more dangerous. But there's a bloodiness about the Nazi symbol and an immediate emotional impact that the hammer and sickle just doesn't produce.
Continue straight for 9 minutes to exit 82, State Route 124, Harwich, Brewster, Old Exit 10.
And some of that's because people are badly educated historically.
I think that's it. I think it's pure ignorance.
Well, I don't think it's just
Really?
ignorance. No,
Do you think that the people that are wearing those Che Guevara t-shirts really understand the history of Che Guevara, or do you think he represents this sexy South American counter-protest character, a guy who stands up to the establishment as we know it, a guy who's wearing a green beret, wearing a beret, hiding in the jungle, fighting against the oppressive? We are brought to you by Roka, R-O-K-A, the only eyewear on the planet made to do badass shit. I'm telling you, their eyeglasses, their sun easy, they'll even see.
those people.
Yeah, well, that was the most disturbing thing for many people about Donald Trump's reaction to it, that he didn't take a hard stance against these white supremacists showing up with tiki torches, walking through the
Which was then promptly canceled by the university. I think a couple of hundred people out to the celebration about and it was very much reminiscent of William F. Buckley divorcing himself from the John Birch Society back in the 1960s. The right wing seems to be easier for the right wing to draw a line around the Nazis and say, no, that's not us. partly because the right-wingers, conservatives, are better at drawing boundaries. But, you know, let's say we wanted to draw a boundary around the radical leftists. Okay, point to something. Well, on the right, you say, well, you wore a swastika. Yeah, you're out of the club, man.
Right.
On the left, well, you believe, what's the smoking pistol? You believe in equity? It's like, that's a smoking pistol as far as I'm concerned, but it doesn't have the same emotional punch as you wore a swastika to the protest.
Yeah, you believe in equity and you refuse to define it. That would be
Right, but I mean,
to me.
right, but that's such a, there's no
you're
emotional
right.
punch in that. It's like, well, I'm not going to associate with you because you believe in equity. It's like,
it's too complicated.
it's right.
I do want to back us up here, though, because I think we underrate the danger of, and I think Nazis are a red herring. There's something that actually does threaten to reemerge, and Charlottesville is a version of it. But I think because we have a cartoon understanding of what that protest was actually about and how many people are actually involved, we don't really see why this is a dangerous and contentious issue. And I think the answer is an evolutionary one that hasn't been spelled out. And because it hasn't been spelled out, it's very hard to point to.
I hate to keep interrupting you, but just get this right up to your face. It sounds good to us, but the people listening online are going to have
Is
an
that
issue.
better?
Yeah, just when you turn to him, just turn the thing with you.
Okay.
Yeah, just get it. Always keep it a fist from your face. That's the
Okay.
best. Sorry.
That's all right.
So explain what you mean by this.
So my point would be that what took place in Germany in the 30s was a particularly visible, well-documented example of a pattern that is much more common in human history. And because this pattern emerges as a result of certain features of the way evolution functions in the context of humans, it is actually always a danger that it will reemerge. And knowing what to do about it is not so simple until you've seen why it occurs and what it means. And what I've been saying in lectures I've given on this is that tyranny is the end game of prosperity. And so there is a pattern in which you will go through a period of prosperousness in which it appears that that thing is defeated once and for all, and there's no reason for people to be going after each other in this particular way. And then at the point that that pattern peters out, it reemerges, and people don't expect it. It flies under a different flag or something like that. And so I do think that looking at the tiny number of people who were doing what they were doing in Charlottesville and saying, well, we all agree that this is wrong, misses the fact that actually I think Trump is doing it cynically, but Trump was riding a wave, that there are ideas which are not permissible from the environments in which we all grew up that are going to become permissible again if we are not careful to recognize that that's the nature of history.
I think it's highly probable that that's going to occur. I mean, part of the reason that I landed in the political hot water that I landed in last year was because I was increasingly aware that this process of polarization was going to take place, and that the continual, in my estimation anyways, the continual clawing of new ground underneath the radical leftist rubric, especially in the universities, is starting to produce an extraordinarily dangerous counterposition. And that was manifest, at least to some degree, in Charlottesville. And so I think you're right, is that, well, you don't want to be complacent and say, well, we know who the Nazis are and we're not going there, and so the problem is solved. The problem isn't solved. There's all sorts of weird activity in the non-radical left space, like on the other side of the radical left, whatever that is. And right now, what it is not obvious. You know, it's the alt-right, that's part of it. It's the Kekastanis, it's this peppy thing. It's some of it's comedy, some of it's satire, some of it's serious, some of it's the inversion of identity politics, which is very dangerous. And it's maybe the most dangerous thing about Charlottesville is that there's something extraordinarily dangerous about having people revert to identification with their racial identity. It's really not a good thing.
Well, there's the reversion to their racial identity. There's basically an outbreak of tribalism, which explains what's going on the far right. What's going on the left is a bit of a new twist. What you have is a coalition of different tribal identities that aren't large enough to marshal a force on their own, and so that they're united. And together they are a formidable force. But what's going to happen is that's an unstable entity. At the point that that force gains power, it's going to come apart as internal dynamics rip it up. So it's not actually it's not capable of restraining the version that recurs on the right, the version that does manifest as white nationalism. That version is stable because it does represent an actual population that has an evolutionary basis for remaining cohesive. And I should point out, there's a danger when you hear an evolutionary biologist talk about evolutionary patterns. People often infer that if an evolutionary biologist is saying that something is a pattern that has evolved, that that's some kind of a defense, and it is absolutely not. We call this the naturalistic fallacy. So evolution is an absolutely amoral process. It has produced the most marvelous features of human beings and the worst features, and we are in some sense obligated to pick and choose which features to honor and promote and which ones to tamp down.
Something can have something can have evolved as a virtue in some circumstances and still be of the type that, if magnified beyond its proper limits, becomes pathological. So let me tell you something I learned about Hitler, which really, I haven't recovered from my shock from this. So we've been looking at the relationship between political belief and personality. Okay, and your political belief is strongly determined by your temperament. So liberal left types are high in trait openness, that's creativity, and low in conscientiousness. But you can fragment conscientiousness up into industriousness and orderliness. And the real predictor for conservatism is in orderliness, not industriousness. And you might think, well, that's no surprise. Right-wingers are more orderly, hence Hitler's call for order, let's say. But it's one thing.
In 1 mile. Exit right to exit 82, State Route 124, Harwich, Brewster, Old Exit 10. Then keep right.
To posit that in another thing to measure it. Now it's measurable. And it appears that orderliness is associated with sensitivity to disgust. And this is actually a really big deal. It's a really big deal. So there's a paper that was published in PLOS One about 3 years ago looking at the relationship between the prevalence of infectious diseases and authoritarian political attitudes. And they did it country by country and then within countries by state or province. And the correlation between the prevalence of infectious diseases and authoritarian / right-wing political beliefs at the local individual level was 0.6. And so I want to take this apart a little bit. Okay, so the idea is that this is part of what you might describe as the extended behavioral immune system. And one of the problems with the interactions between groups of human beings in our evolutionary past was, well, exactly what happened to the Native Americans is, they came out and shook hands.
Exit right to exit 82, State Route 124, Harwich, Brewster, Old Exit 10. Then keep right to State Route 124.
With the Spanish conquistadors, and then within a couple of generations, 90% of them.
Keep right to State Route 124.
Dead of smallpox and measles and mumps. And so it's been a truism in our evolutionary past that if you meet a group of if you're a group of isolated humans and you meet another group of isolated humans and you trade pathogens, there's a real possibility that you and everyone you know are going to be dead in no time flat. And so we have a disgust mechanism.
In 1.1 miles. Turn left on State Route 39.
That produces this implicit, let's call it racial and ethnic bias that is part and parcel of the human cognitive landscape. But the problem with that is that it's rooted in a disgust mechanism that actually serves a protective function. Now, when I was sorting this out, I was reading Hitler's Table Talk, and Hitler's Table Talk is a very interesting book. It's a book of his spontaneous mealtime utterances from 1939 to 1942. And I went through with this new knowledge because people think of conservatives as or fascists as afraid of those who are different. They're not afraid. They're disgusted. And that's not the same thing because you burn things you're disgusted by. And so it was terrifying to me to read it because then I also thought, oh, well, disgust sensitivity is associated with orderliness and you need order in a society in order to maintain it. And the Germans are very orderly, and that was actually a canonical.
In half a mile. Turn left. Then turn right.
Of their civilization and part of actually what makes them great and powerful. And that just had to tilt a little farther than necessary. And all of a sudden everything needed to get cleaned. And Hitler talked about cleanliness all the time, and he actually meant that. And so this thing that's emerging, you talked about its biological basis, its evolutionary basis. It is. It's part of this deeply rooted disgust system that protects us from dangerous pathogens that can manifest itself and does manifest itself in the political realm. It's not good.
So I don't know exactly how to tease this apart, but I agree with your point about there's an actual danger when populations meet, like a literal pathogen danger, and that is liable to have produced a certain instinctive fear.
Turn left on State Route 39. Then turn right on Bank Street.
Of the other, which doesn't have to be limited to that one thing, but that's enough to generate a selective force that would cause a certain reluctance to meet. But I want to point out that at least in the West, and probably universally, human beings, when they go to war, tend to dehumanize the other population. And, so, of course, calling the other population subhuman, vermin, whatever it is that human beings do. And my concern is that we are doing exactly this with the Nazis or de facto Nazis who are showing up on our screens at this point. That what we are doing is we are comforting.
Turn right on Bank Street.
By saying, well, that's a small outbreak of something that makes these people subhuman, justifies punching them or whatever. And I'm not squeamish about their.
In 1 mile. Turn right on Miles Street.
A right to violence when somebody is threatening a way of life. So it's not that. But my concern is that if you take the pathogen model and you imagine that all those folks who showed up in Charlottesville, that is a contagion and it needs to be isolated, then you will have the sense that as long as you do that, it's not going to show up somewhere else. Whereas what's, I think, the actual hazard is that that's actually a latent program that has served populations in past circumstances. It's indefensible, but it has served populations, and the populations that we come from have it, therefore, on reserve. And when certain characteristics show up in the environment, that program can emerge. And so my
In half a mile, turn right.
concern is that that's where we are in
Right.
history.
It can't be isolated as a phenomenon that's associated with the other.
Right.
I mean, one of the things I've done for decades is teach my students a variant of that, which is something like, because I try to walk them through psychological understanding of what happened in Nazi Germany, and in the more intense situations, like in places like in Auschwitz. So the question might be, well, if you were in Germany in the 1930s, could you be a concentration camp guard? And the gut reaction to that is, no, those people are unlike me. And that's the wrong response. The right response is, those people were human, and I'm also human, and so that means that the Nazi is us. That's what it
Turn right on Miles Street.
means. And so, and who the hell wants to think?
You've arrived. Destination is on your left.